Today we're going to be talking about the exodus of our youth from the church and what we can do to reverse that trend by building a foundation of faith in a hostile culture. In the movie Apollo 13, the crew made this statement to ground control when they found a major problem on their spacecraft. "Houston, we have a problem." This statement could also be restated to us. Church, we have a problem. The problem is the increasing percentage of Americans who doubt God's existence and the large departure of our youth from the church after high school. Now, the reason 2/3 of our church youth stop attending after they leave high school is due to a variety of reasons. But a major cause is the constant promotion of an atheistic worldview in our culture that challenges both their faith and causes them to have doubts about what they believe. Our hostile culture is also having an impact on the adult population both inside and outside the church. Now, an outline of my talk will be as follows. We're going to be looking at polls on belief and youth departure and why they leave. We're also going to be defining terms, evolution and science. This is so important. We're going to be talking about science, and the purpose of my talk is not to have an academic debate. It's really about salvation. And the issues of science are only relevant if it either keeps individuals from believing in Jesus or causes them to lose their Christian faith. We're going to look at a dilemma, and our youth departure is preventable, but the church must first address a dilemma. And this dilemma is why the problem has been going on for the past 20 years. And number 4, we're going to look at solutions. And yes, there are solutions, but first you have to understand why they're departing. Okay, number 1, polls and surveys. In the 2007 Pew Research poll of adult Americans, they found that 71% were certain that God exists. 8 years later, that number had dropped to 63% were certain. And if we look at those under the age of 30 in 2015, the number was roughly half were not certain that God exists. The Washington Examiner had an article based upon the 2016 Pew Research poll that found Americans are giving up on God, miracles. And what they're talking about is those that were leaving the church. An overwhelming majority of people in America still believe in God. They found in this article that 49% of Americans who have left their church no longer believe in God. And the major reasons were learning about evolution or lack of any scientific or specific evidence of a creator. With the scientific discoveries over the past 20 years, belief in a supernatural creator should be increasing, not decreasing. This is unexcusable. In fact, Anthony Flew, the most respected atheist thinker of the 20th century, author of many books on atheism, in 2004 made a public statement, this famous atheist did, that he now believes in God based on scientific evidence that a supernatural, some sort of intelligence must have created the universe. It's the only good explanation for the origin of life and the complexity of nature. Now, Flew knew the new discoveries. What made him change his mind after being a lifelong atheist? The scientific evidence. What this is saying is Dr. Flew's prior views, which is mainstream in our culture, were not proven scientific facts. Quite the opposite. And in his opinion, the creation account was the strongest position based upon the evidence. 1 year after Dr. Flew made this public statement that he believes in God, in 2005 began the era of a new atheism, no longer just neutral and privately holding their feelings to themselves. This is a more aggressive position that attacks the belief in God. After these books came out in 2010, Anthony Flew published this book, There Is a God. And he criticizes the books in the previous slide by saying they refuse to engage the real issues involved in the question of God's existence. Their books just claim, for example, a miracle happened. And he said that Dawkins' rejection of an ultimate intelligence is a matter of belief without proof. And we're talking about scientific proof. And like many whose belief are based on blind faith, he cannot tolerate dissent. He summarized the reasons that he rejected atheism is that the evidence is inadequate to support the conclusion that natural processes can remotely accomplish what is claimed. And science, as he points out, doesn't say anything. Scientists do, and they have a lot of philosophical assumptions. And these scientists are making claims way beyond what the evidence can reasonably support. In other words, there's a lot of truth claims being made about science that simply are not true. Shortly after Flu's book came out, these books were published, and all of these books are designed to give tools to talk Christians out of their faith. And not only are our children bombarded with secular naturalism in school and our culture, they're being targeted by the American Humanist Association with the goal to be non-believers. And these recent billboards demonstrate that the new atheism movement is more militant, that a belief in God should no longer be accepted or tolerated. It should be criticized and undermined whenever possible. All right, let's take a look at a poll, a Gallup poll in May of 2017 on American belief. This is adults. 38% found or believe that God created man in his present form within the last 10,000 years. You might call these young earth creationists. This is down from a 2000 poll just 17 years ago in which the number was 47%. 38% believe that God used evolution over millions of years to create man, and that's slightly down from 40%. And 19% believed that evolution created man over millions of years without God. And that number was 9% just 17 years ago, so it's more than doubled, despite the evidence of science against this possibility. Now, if we add the bottom two groups together, we have 57% who believe in evolution over millions of years. Now, the Gallup poll also found that on those who attend church on a weekly basis, 67% are those that believe that God created man under 10,000 years. 25% are those people who believe God guided evolution over millions of years, and only 3% that believe natural processes alone created mankind. In 2016, the Discovery Institute did a survey of 3,700 adults, including 1,100 atheists, and they were asking the question, what makes God's existence less likely? The survey found that unguided chemical evolution, which is another word for the origin of life, and the Darwinian evolution are the most significant drivers of science-related erosion in faith in God. Now, they found that number one was unguided chemical evolution, origin of life. Number two is the Big Bang. And number three is evil and suffering. Now, the evidence for the existence of God and of evil in the world, they're two separate topics. The kind of world people are yearning for was the first world that God created before the fall of man. And God's going to be addressing evil in the final solution. Now, incredibly, over 2/3 of the atheists made unguided chemical evolution or the origin of life as their number one reason for not believing in God. And why this is baffling is that the extreme complexity of life is the number one reason for people who are certain of God's existence. So what do the experts admit about this subject of the origin of life? Well, Stuart Kaufman, professor of biophysics, University of Chicago, in his book said, anyone who tells you that he knows how life started on Earth is a fool or dishonest. Nobody knows. Dr. Harold, PhD at Colorado State University, wrote a book, The Way of the Cell, and he admitted, let me concede that there are no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system. only a variety of wishful speculations. Let me restate what this means. There has never been one shred of evidence that matter on any level chemically can or will organize itself, let alone upward into higher levels of life. Now, you won't find the statement of Dr. Harold in any school textbook or all of those books written by atheists about God not existing. You see, there's a huge disparity between the public presentation on the origin of life and evolution and the actual status of it as you find in peer-reviewed scientific journals or scientific books. Nevertheless, Dr. Harold said, life arose here on Earth from inanimate matter by some kind of evolutionary process. This is not a statement of demonstrable fact, but an assumption. So nevertheless, Dr. Harold assumes that life arose. Indeed, it is an assumption despite all the contrary evidence. An assumption is another word for faith. And I'll tell you, it's not represented as an assumption in our public schools or in our culture. So we all saw the books written by atheists, six or more, criticizing the belief in God. What is their creation story? Well, it goes something like this. Once upon a time, out of nothing, and due to only unguided natural processes, a dense mass the size of a golf ball suddenly appeared and expanded to form stars and galaxies, known as the Big Bang. 9 billion years later, Earth formed by clumping together spinning dust and gas. 1 billion years later, inorganic material made the first living single-cell organism with coded information that was capable of reproducing. And then through a process of genetic copying mistakes or errors, mutations, the descendants of the single cell eventually change into extremely complex plant and animal life, and eventually through random errors made mankind with the brain that processes information faster than any known computer. This is not science. It's 100% a matter of faith. It's a religious belief. And this religion has no buildings or clergy, but secularism or atheism is a religion. Nevertheless, we are bombarded daily that this secular creation story is a scientific fact. So in terms of the education of students in the United States, 87% attend public schools, 10% attend private schools, and 3% are homeschooled. So it's estimated that 85 to 90% of students from church homes attend public schools who are indoctrinated from the 5th grade to believe in secular humanism. Now, in surveys, Life Research conducted a survey in August of 2007 and found 70% of the Christian youth leave the church after high school. Two separate surveys were done in 2008 and 2011, already gone and you lost me, by the Barna group, and they found it was 60% of Christian youth leave after high school. Now, the Barna group also determined in a 2004 poll that of the adults who accepted Jesus, 64% did so before the age of 18. And after age 18, the number was 36%. So we have this dangerous trend that we must reverse, where 64% are accepting Jesus as their Savior before age 18, and 66% of the church youth leave the church after they leave high school. Now, the reasons for the youth's departure are many, and J. Warner Wallace, I saw in a YouTube interview, was asked about this question. And he said, number one, the students are not prepared to defend what they believe. Their faith is shallow. Number two, there's hostility in both our culture and campus towards Christian belief. And number three, the basic human nature to follow our own desires and have independence. Now, of these three, Mr. Wallace said that the parents and the church can only fix reason number one. However, if we fix reason number one, they will survive the hostile culture. And they're signs of a shallow faith. And one of the most consistent indicator is not asking questions. Now, a shallow faith is usually borrowed. It's not their own. And they may be uninterested and don't see the importance of Christianity in their lives. Their faith hasn't been challenged yet. So challenge them to defend before someone else does. Don't wait for their questions. Ask them questions. They may be uncertain or scared of your reaction. They may think if they ask questions or have doubts that they lack faith in your eyes. And they may be getting answers elsewhere from the wrong place. In Barna's book by David Kinnaman, You Lost Me, which the title really means You Aren't Making Sense to Me, most of the students said they don't feel they can ask their most pressing life questions in church. What he found is what they need is real dialogue and real answers to their questions. Now, the book also found that the majority felt the church was anti-science or out of step with the scientific world. Why do the students feel this way? Was it because they were taught apologetics in creation? No, it was because they were not. Only 1% said their youth pastor or youth worker had addressed issues of science in the past year. Now, pastors may also not be trained in this area. Dr. Mortensen of the Institute for Creation Research found out of 36 seminaries who were surveyed, only 2 had a required course dealing with the evolution debate. David Kinnaman said in his book, "Look, I'm not suggesting churches should change the entire approach, but if only 1 out of 100 youth workers are talking about the issues of science, how can we possibly hope to prepare a generation to follow Jesus in our science-dominated culture?" Now, in the 2008 research that was published in the book Already Gone by the American Research Group, they interviewed 1,000 people between the ages of 20 and 29 who attended church regularly while growing up but don't attend today. The churches that they attended were conservative and evangelical, not liberal. And they interviewed individuals from coast to coast, and it was balanced according to population and gender. The results were nothing significant between homeschoolers and secular school students leaving. Nothing significant about genders leaving. The 1,000 who left church looked like the 40% of the youth that stayed. When did they have their doubts or start to leave even though they still sat in the pews? 84% were lost during middle and high school. And in answer to the question, when did they have their first doubts about the counts in the Bible being true? 40% had them in middle school, 44% in high school, and by the time they got to college, it was 11%. So we lose more in middle school and high school than by obviously college. The results, 61% of those who left attended Sunday school. It had no impact on them staying, similar to the homeschool, because they were not engaged or taught about the evidence and the discussion about evolution and those scientific topics. Now, I'm not saying that doubts about science and the Bible are the only reasons our youth leave. They may be mad at what other people inside the church did or don't like the church's position on certain issues. But if we address this one issue, we may be able to cut the departure rate in half. The research also found while our culture is aggressively teaching Darwinian evolution and secular humanism, the teachings in Sunday school did not address these topics. Now, since we start to lose our youth in middle school, I wanted to share some questions that students had about the Bible who attended a large private school in Temecula, California. I was invited to speak at their assembly, and the junior high pastor collected their written questions and anonymous questions for me to address. And as I go through these questions, think what your answers might have been if you had been in my shoes. Now, out of 245 students, 93 submitted written questions. So if you want questions, ask your middle school. Out of those 93 questions, 48 or 52% concern dinosaurs and the age of the earth. Like, for example, how and when did the dinosaurs die? They're trying to get an idea of not only how, but how does that line up within the biblical timeline? How long ago did dinosaurs roam the earth? When were the dinosaurs created? Did Noah bring dinosaurs on the ark? How old is the earth, and how do you know that? I love that. If we weren't here before dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are proven to be real, when did we come in? Were there ever cavemen, and how did they survive? Have you found anything or seen anything that has been actually said in the Bible? I love that. What is evolution? How did it begin? What is some evidence that evolution has occurred? Do you have any unbiblical proof of creation? So what the church youth want to know is if there's an alternative scientific explanation compared to what they're being taught in school. Okay, number 2, we're going to be understanding key terms and definitions. And this is very important before we get into solutions. It's the key to understanding the big picture. And it's critical for everyone to understand this, not just the youth, but the parents as well, because there's a lot of misrepresentation about what they mean. There is a myth in our culture. Christian belief is in conflict with science. And Dr. Frank Turek in crossexamine.org, which is an apologetics ministry for youth, is that the belief that Christianity is opposed to modern science is one of the top reasons young people cite for leaving the church. Now, Christianity is not at war with proven scientific facts. That is why you have to know these terms. Okay, the first word is evolution. And if you're asked if you believe in evolution, your response should be, what type of evolution are you talking about? It is a word with 2 different meanings. The first is microevolution, and the second is, which is variation within kinds, and the second is your grander macroevolution, which is really Darwinian evolution. Now, microevolution, we're talking about limited variations. The offspring or descendants and the ancestors come from the same kind of family. For example, breeders can take 2 mongrel dogs and over the years of selective breeding produce 350 different breeds that we have today. But they're still dogs. This variation is based upon existing genetic information, not anything new being added. There is over 350 breeds of horses and 7,000 different varieties of apples. How does this variation occurs? Well, it occurs through the fact that almost all animals and even plants reproduce sexually, which produces a huge possibility of genetic variation within these bounded kinds. For example, in the human, we have a total of 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. But the number of chromosomes in our sex cells is half of that. It's 23, and there's no pairs. So how that occurs is, here's our 23 pairs, and it randomly selects one of the chromosomes out of the pair. So, for example, in the adult male or female, the different combination is 2 times 2 times 2 out to 23 times. That's equal to 8 million different combinations. The same would be true for the female's egg, for example. So in other words, each human couple could produce a child with over 64 trillion unique genetic combinations. And there's only about 7 billion people in the world. So there's no dispute that a variety of existing genes can produce a wide variety of traits within an interbreeding population. The wolf kind produce a large variety of dogs, but there's genetic boundaries, and this is what we observe in breeding experiments, that dogs remain dogs. Now, what we're talking about, in other words, because this term is used, is descent with modification. This is true. Present-day animals are descended from similar animals that lived earlier with modifications. Mankind and the different races are descended from one human male and female. I am descended from my mother and father, and I have modifications because I am not identical to them. Okay, we looked at microevolution. Now let's look at Darwinian or macroevolution. Under this theory, natural processes can produce unlimited variation, and the descendants are hugely different than their ancestors. In what is known as the tree of life, we have a universal common ancestor, a bacteria of some sort, single cell, that got everything going, and over time things change to plants and animals all the way up to mankind. Now this is a religious belief, regardless if it's in a science textbook. And what is interesting is that what is known as the Cambrian explosion, these animal groups appear in the fossil record with virtually at the same geologic time with no evolutionary history. So to get a good comparison, the bottom is Darwinian evolution, universal common ancestor, in which all life sprung from. And the chart on top is microevolution, which is what we observe. We observe that from wolves came the dog kind, from cats the cat kind, from horses the different variety of horses, different kinds of apes, different kinds of pine trees. And so they had a common ancestor, but not a universal one. Darwinian evolution isn't just an attack on Genesis. In this high school biology book, the statement is made, Darwin's immeasurably important contribution to science was to show how mechanistic causes could explain all biological phenomena, despite their apparent evidence of design and purpose. Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of the life processes superfluous, in other words, unnecessary. This is a religious, faith-based statement in a science textbook and is outside the mission of public education. Okay, so that's evolution. The next word is assumption. Now, assumption is a thing that is accepted as true or is certain to happen without proof. Synonyms are supposition, speculation, guess, premise, hypothesis, belief, and faith. Our assumptions are used, however, to interpret the world around us. Next word is indoctrinate, to teach a person a one-sided view of something and ignore or dismiss evidence that doesn't agree with your view. This often happens in our culture when teachings are based upon unproven assumptions. And one can minimize this indoctrination by understanding the evidence of both sides of an issue. The next word is fact. That is reality that cannot be logically disputed or rejected. A concept whose truth can be proved. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, not at 34. An assumption is not a fact, no matter what the consensus is or how many people believe it. The next word is philosophy, and that uses rational arguments and critical thinking to know and perceive the world around them. It's grounded in arguments which are reasoned attempts to convince a particular audience to accept a particular point of view about a debatable topic. Now, Apostle Paul was well aware of philosophy and used it in debates with the Greeks. Now, the word science is a little different. Accomplishments of science have really transformed the world and have increased the quality and length of human life. It is the study and understanding of the natural world. Evidences that can be observed, tested, measured, and repeated to support or refute a hypothesis. There's little opportunity for bias or assumptions. The results cannot be overstated in science. Now, Bertrand Russell, famous atheist and philosopher, said, "Science is what you know, philosophy is what you don't know." Daniel Dennett, an author and an atheist, wrote, "There is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination." Dennett, in essence, is saying there are unproven assumptions embedded in scientific claims which are taken at face value without any questioning or examination. And that's really the big issue. The Christian belief is not in conflict with science, proven facts. The dispute is over the underlying assumptions propping up these scientific claims. Now, in September 2016, Rob Stadler wrote The Scientific Approach to Evolution. Dr. Stadler is a medical engineer from Harvard, 19 years as a scientist, over 100 U.S. patents. In fact, his research in medical devices is inside over 1 million people worldwide. And in his book, he wrote, "The conflict between science and faith can be resolved by understanding the inherent limitations of science. Science cannot answer all of our questions." So Dr. Stadler outlined two different types of science. There's high-confidence science and low-confidence science. High-confidence science is typically called science, whereas the low-confidence is philosophy. High confidence is operational science, where low confidence is more of a historical narrative. The historical narrative is theoretical about unproven assumptions regarding past events that were not observed. And like a domino, most, if not all, of these series of assumptions are dependent upon all of the assumptions being true. And if one of them is false, the whole theory collapses. You might say that high confidence science is fact-based, where low confidence requires a lot of faith and is faith-based. So as an example, the high confidence science is based upon repeatable, measurable, observable, no opportunity for bias, careful to avoid assumptions type of science. This is the science that we rely upon and use to prove things. The low confidence science is not repeatable, not observable, requires many assumptions and inferences, and the opportunity for bias is huge. Now, the chart exposes the limitations of science, which is on the left, as compared to the grand assertions about science on the right. The right column is theoretical in nature, which are ideas that cannot be proven. Okay, examples of high confidence science is Boyle's gas law, Newton's law of gravity, microevolution, the first law of thermodynamics, sunlight taking 8 minutes to reach Earth, Kepler's law of planetary motion. Low confidence is origin of the universe, origin of life, macroevolution, age of the universe, Earth, distance of further star, and the geologic column. High confidence is factual, low confidence is faith-based. It's also disputed despite museums and textbooks claiming they are facts. Now, I will be discussing all of the assumptions of evolution, age of the Earth, distant starlight in part 2 in a separate YouTube video called Assumptions. Okay, let's look at the dilemma in the church and then also the solutions to our problem. This won't take as long, but the first part of it was so important just to kind of build the understanding in the back work in order to address these issues. We must understand what has caused the church's inaction for the past 20 years. And from all the evidence, I believe it's the wide diversity of interpretation of Genesis, the difference in belief in the age of the earth, and whether or not evolution is a viable mechanism for change. In 2012, Barna did a poll of pastors' beliefs about origins, and 19% were certain that the earth was young and God created supernaturally. 35% leaned in that direction for a total of 54%. Of those that believe God used evolution as the mechanism, 3% had a level of certainty and 15% leaned in that direction for a total of 18%. Under the category of progressive creation, these are people that believe that the earth is billions of years old and God created in stages, but evolution is not possible whatsoever. 7% certain and 8% leaned in that direction. And of those that were just kind of uncertain, it was 12%. So if we step back and take a look at this poll, first of all the pastors believe God created the universe and life. 29% were certain in their beliefs, and 70% leaned in a direction but were not certain. Now, if we add up the left side, the left column of those that had a certain belief, 70% have rejected outright Darwinian evolution. So the dilemma in the church shows this, that the polls show a majority of Americans believe that humans have evolved over millions of years, and these are adult Americans. The number is even higher if you're under the age of 30. The age of the earth should never be a stumbling block or nonsense to belief in Jesus Christ. And approximately 2/3 of the adults in America firmly believe the earth is old. On the other hand, they have doubts about the origin of life and evolution. And that is where we should focus. When I'm asked by a non-believer, for example, and I'm talking about evolution and creation, and they'll fold their arms and say, just how old do you think the earth is? I say, I don't know, that there's evidence on both sides. Okay? However, claims of Big Bang, origin of life, age of earth, and evolution cause youth raised in the church to doubt their faith. So we have that issue going on. Now, here are two soldiers for Christ who I absolutely admire, but have two opposing positions. On the left is William Lane Craig from Biola University. He believes the universe is 13.9 billion years old. He made a public statement that it was an embarrassment that a majority of pastors believe in a young earth, referring to the previous Barna slide. You see, Dr. Craig believes the alleged billions of years of the universe age is unquestionably true. He also works in an academic environment and may believe a young earth position could be a stumbling block to faith in Jesus. He does not believe in Darwinian evolution, but calling young earth pastors an embarrassment is a rather harsh statement, especially since the belief is based upon unproven assumptions, the belief of an old universe, and there are hundreds of PhD scientists who believe in a younger universe. Now, Ken Ham on the right is founder of the ministry Answers in Genesis. He built a creation museum in Kentucky with a scale replication of Noah's Ark. His organization focuses on teaching within the church to support their faith. He has participated in surveys on why our youth leave. Now, he has called Christians like Dr. Craig as compromising the scripture. So you see, bringing this issue up has a potential cost to the church. It's toxic and it's very divisive. And however, though, not addressing the subject has an even greater cost. This eternal division within the church and the public opinion is one of the reasons why only 1% of youth pastors have addressed the issues and topics of science in the past 12 months, according to Barna. However, when we avoid this topic, we are walking away from the battle, and there are consequences for that. So let me briefly outline some solutions, and hopefully these solutions will dramatically reverse the exodus of youth from the church. First of all, we have certain core beliefs and everything else is a secondary issue. And different views about the origin should not be a point of division with other godly men. And we're standing united on the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, and through his death and resurrection, we can have a right relationship with God, whose forgiveness was made possible by Jesus dying on the cross for our sins. Okay, the solution. Number one, This is critical. Everyone should recognize the distinction between operational science, that's which are the proven facts, and the theoretical science, which is based upon a lot of assumptions and may be false philosophy. Colossians 2:8 says, "Don't let anyone capture you with empty philosophies." That's some form of human interpretation that is empty and baseless, and high-sounding nonsense, which some redefine that as deception, that come from human thinking and from spiritual powers of this world rather from Christ. Number 2, we should urge restraint and respect among Christians on matters that are open to question and obscure. Otherwise, there's a risk of falling into error. We cannot focus our attention on the age of the earth issues and ignore the most important issue, that the existence of God is knowable from what has been made. So the age of the earth is not an issue we go to war over. 1 Corinthians 8:11 says, "But while knowledge makes us feel important, it is love that strengthens the church." We don't have all the answers. There are things we don't know. There are things that we don't know that we don't know. Number 3, a commitment to a ruling scientific interpretation where there's consensus can later be embarrassing to the gospel. And the Roman Catholic Church condemned Galileo, whose research showed that the sun was at the center of the universe and not the earth. The church believed the earth was at the center, not because of what the Bible had said, but because it had been the ruling scientific belief for almost 2,000 years since Aristotle. And our science books are always being revised. Number 4, the entire Christian community must work together to prepare students for what they will face in school and our culture. We've got to stop walking away from the battle, and what they will face is very hostile. There is no question that a Christian need to fear, only to learn how to answer. We should teach on the origin of life and evolution. We need to educate the parents. There are strong arguments for the existence of God. The Fallout survey conducted by Creation International found there was a direct correlation to the students who stayed in church who had been exposed to teaching on creation. And number 3, Christians should do their study. They need to be strong and fair and not intimidated by our culture's secular science. Most people inside, and especially those outside the church, are not aware of the many discredited proofs of what is being represented as factual. Steve Kozik, executive director for the Awana Youth Ministry, came out on his website with, "We've got to make apologetics part of the youth ministry's DNA. We need to create a culture of questions where it's safe to ask anything. We need to put students in the hot seat, experience real-life conditions and questions, and even recommend calling in experts, someone that's not part of the regular group." I believe it's important that people inside the church know the evidence and assumptions for both sides. What's the evidence for a young and old? Macroevolution and creation, the origin of life. What are those based upon? And I'll be focusing on these issues in part 2, called Assumptions. Now, to conclude, Dr. Biddle, who is the founder of Genesis Apologetics, ranked the typical responses of our youth from worst to best. The worst, he said, would be those that were talked out of their faith. Beginning in 6th grade, evolutionary theory is presented as a fact, and it seems to be backed by scientific evidence. So the kids listen to it. They're not provided with a counter argument to it. It sinks into their minds and hearts, and they eventually walk away from their Christian faith. The second would be apathetic. They may have doubts. They may merge the beliefs, their Christian beliefs, with the secular beliefs. The next and next best would be to hold their own. And in order for them to hold their own, that's going to require lots of teaching and efforts, because the culture is very hostile to their belief. And the best would be evangelists who know the information. They respectfully ask good questions of the teacher and their fellow students, and they serve as a resource to help remove barriers to faith in Christ. Now imagine the impact, not only the church youth, but those outside the church, if more of our youth fell into these top two groups instead of the bottom two. If you have any further interest in my website, proofforfaith.org, I have other presentations such as Starlight in Time, What Happened to the Dinosaurs, and including this one. And to get a brief idea of some of the underlying assumptions underlining the age of the universe and Starlight, the origin of life, evolution, that would be in part 2 entitled Assumptions.